As you all know, the Israel-Palestine conflict once again heated up early on Saturday, and they're very much at war at this point, as Benjamin Netanyahu has pointed out. This all started because on Saturday there was a music festival on the border of Gaza, and basically members of Hamas parachuted over the border and were able to bypass Israeli security, and they started indiscriminately killing various Israelis and people from other countries actually that were at this music festival. They kidnapped a bunch of Israeli women and children. They raped women, Israeli women, and even murdered a bunch of people. Um, in fact, the one example that stands out in my head is of the 30-year-old woman who was from Germany who was there at the music festival, which, by the way, the purpose of this festival or the goal was to promote Israel-Palestine peace. Um, but yeah, this woman from Germany was kidnapped and raped and eventually murdered. And as I mentioned, other Israeli citizens have been kidnapped. Once the news had spread across the globe that uh, Israel and Palestine were now once again at war, uh, you know, other notable events occurred in countries such as the USA. There were demonstrations, pro-Palestine demonstrations that occurred in most notably New York City and I believe Washington D.C. too. Um, and in the NYC demonstration, they were chanting pro-Palestine, anti-Israel slogans such as "From river to sea, Palestine shall be free," which implies the destruction of Israel and the Jewish state, and it's basically calling for the genocide of Israeli Jews. Now, obviously, Israel retaliated, and from the last I've seen, they regained much of the territory that was briefly lost to Hamas. But if you've been paying attention to the news surrounding this war between Israel and Palestine via Twitter, or you've read articles about people's reactions on Twitter, you'll notice that there's a lot of Hamas apologetics going on, and yeah, basically support for Hamas's actions, and basically, well, no, not basically, straight up war crimes where they killed civilians and raped women, Israeli women. Um, and what also I've noticed there's a lot of PhDs in post-colonial studies or um, decolonization activists who are giving a lot of, quite frankly, stupid takes. And this is just another reason why I think post-colonial studies are straight up garbage, along with any other postmodern and influenced field of study. But what's being missed by, or what the post-colonial PhDs or scholars and the decolonization activists, quote unquote, are getting straight up wrong is when they make the argument that Israel is a colonizing or apartheid force that is oppressing or subjugating the indigenous uh, Palestinians to apartheid conditions, essentially implying that the Israelis are a non-indigenous colonial force or power that's um, subjugating the Palestinians to colonial conditions a la South Africa or any of the British colonies. But one, that's straight up false because based on DNA studies, we know that all Jews, whether it be Ashkenazi, Sephardic, or Mizrahi, trace their ancestry back to Israel. They share a common ancestry that goes back to that area, and I've explained this in my Kyrie Irving video. But you can't be a colonial or non-indigenous, quote unquote, European imperializing colonial power if your ancestry goes back to the very region that you're supposedly colonizing. Which is what's happening is, uh, or what happened was the Jews, whether it be European, Mizrahi, or Sephardic, were returning to their homeland starting in the late 19th century, uh, which was spearheaded by the Zionist movement. Um, and the reason the Zionist movement, or the desire for Jews to go back to their homeland, uh, arose in the late 19th century was due to the various European nationalist movements that arose. And the Jews also wanted a homeland, or a nation, where a Jewish nation, similar to how Germans want, or Germans had a nation for the Germans, and Italians had a nation for the Italians. Or more specifically, how the Germans had a state for the German people and Italians had a state for the Italian people. After both of these respective nations had united, the Jews wanted a state for the Jewish people. And once the Jews started settling what is now Israel slash Palestine, they, while they were settling, they didn't invade, or there wasn't an invasion or a conquering force. They slowly migrated in and they started buying up land from Palestinians who willingly sold this land, or various pieces of land, to the Jews, who then built homes on these pieces of land. And this gradually kept occurring, and gradually more Jews started immigrating or migrating to Palestine and buying up property from Palestinians. And also a quick point, I should point out that there was never an official state called Palestine. There was a region called Syria Palestina that was named by the which was the name that the Romans gave that specific region, which was the name of a Roman province. After Roman Byzantine rule had ended, um, in the subsequent centuries and millennia, there had always been a conquering, or imperial force that had control of that region. Uh, the Arabs had control, then the Seljuk Turks, and then eventually the Ottoman Turks. And by the time that the Jews had started moving back into the region of Palestine, it was still under Ottoman rule. Um, so basically, all of that is to say that there was never a official state named Palestine. But anyways, by 1917, as some of you may know, the Balfour Declaration was written up, and it basically gave support for Jews to return to Israel Palestine. And after this is when the real conflict starts to gain steam, uh, or start to break out. Uh, in 1929, there was a outbreak in violence of Palestinians against Jews, and a lot of it was spearheaded by leaders such as Sheikh Is al-Din al-Qassam, who basically galvanized or mobilized a bunch of Palestinians and prepared them for jihad against the Jewish migrants returning home to Israel, Palestine. Then in the 30s, there was continuing revolts by the Palestinians against both Jews and British authorities who were in Palestine. Um, and there was a mass revolt in 1936. So all this is to say that um, the narrative pushed by pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, uh, and these PhDs in post-colonial studies, the narrative that they push, that the violence, the violence or attack by Hamas that occurred on Saturday, and any other recent outbreaks of violence by Hamas against the Israeli state, is somehow justified, or is a result of quote unquote Israeli provocation. Um, they're leaving out a bunch of history, and they're ironically leaving out a bunch of context. And it's ironic because they accuse pro-Israel advocates of leaving out context. But Um, but even before Israel was a official state, there had been Arab-Palestinian violence or hostilities towards the Jewish migrants or Jewish people that had returned to Israel. And also, these pro Palestine, pro Hamas advocates seem to forget that in 1967, Israel was surrounded and attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. So basically, ganged up by all these Islamic countries. But even let's go back even further. Let's say to the uh, birth of Islam or the early medieval period of Islam. Historians of early Islam or early medieval Islam all agree that there were actually tensions or conflict between Muhammad and his followers and Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula. For example, Muhammad and his army attacked the Jewish tribe known as the Banu Qurayza, probably mispronounced that, and laid siege to them for 25 days. And another example is with the Yemenite Jews. Although this example isn't explicit violence, it's mistreatment at the hands of the Arab Muslims. In the 15th century, the basically the social status and economic status of the Jews in Yemen uh, had dramatically decreased. When I think about the Palestinian attack on Israel that occurred on Saturday and other instances of Palestinian violence against the Israeli state, um, it's kind of makes sense to me because they are especially Hamas is a jihadist group, and basically what they're doing isn't really any different than what Muhammad did in the early history of Islam or during the birth of Islam in the early 7th century, or various other Muslim groups throughout history. And as for the narrative that Israel keeps moving into Palestinian land and is uh, basically continues to occupy Palestinian land, in 1949 there was a UN partition plan that was basically going to split, is basically a two-state solution where it's evenly split, or maybe not evenly because the Jews would have gotten a strip of coast on the basically around the area of the Galilee, which they already had under Ottoman rule. But basically, they would the UN this UN partition plan would have been favorable to the Palestinians, but even even with this deal, the Palestinian Arabs rejected it. So they had every opportunity to have a sizable piece of land and sovereign nation, but they wouldn't agree to the UN partition plan. Chose to fight instead. So basically, to sum up, I wanted to make this video to kind of explain what's going on in with the Israel-Palestine conflict and maybe give some much-needed historical and cultural context. And if I were to sum up which side is right or who's the more moral side in this conflict, I would just say, um, while Israel is a democratic nation, a secular nation in the Middle East that promotes Western values like freedom of religion and freedom of speech, while Palestine, specifically Hamas, is a militant jihadist nation at this point that uses human shields and launches rockets from residential neighborhoods and from beside schools and hospitals. Oh, and something else I should point out with regards to the talking point that Israel keeps the Palestinians in apartheid conditions. Uh, Palestinians are allowed to become Israeli citizens. And there's I forget the exact numbers, but there's a notable amount of Palestinian Israeli citizens. But again, uh, to if you want an idea of which side is more moral, just remember that Israel is a democratic nation, one of the very few democratic nations in the Middle East that promotes Western values and secularism, while Hamas is a jihadist uh, group that is in power in Palestine and uses human shields and launches rockets from residential areas. So that's all I have to say about that's all I have to say about the recent news with this conflict.